All right. Good afternoon, everybody. We're delighted here today to be hosting Dr. Tariq Banuri. He is Federal Minister and the Chairman of the Higher Education Commission of Pakistan, and he was visiting Almaty. And through the efforts of Dr. Lakha, we have him here for a few hours, and very pleased to have him here. Dr. Banuri, also please note this lecture is being telecast on our internal network, so on 15 locations, but it's also available for anybody to view. So it's a regular part of our distinguished lecture series. A little bit of a background, because Dr. Banuri has been a part of the higher education revolution of Pakistan since its very inception. In fact, all three of us were there because Dr. Lakha chaired the steering committee for higher education, which was 12 people nominated by the government of Pakistan in 2001 and 2 to draft the blueprint of higher education change in Pakistan. But Tariq was the real secretary of the commission and driving it, and I was a member of that commission. And so when the commission then was formed, I was the only member of that steering committee that joined it. Tariq was at the University of Utah and pursuing his research interest in climate change and water. So then I became the chief executive of that organization. Dr. Lakha served on the commission, and now he has come back, and now he's again a member of that commission, and Tariq is the chairman. So small world, but Tariq also at the University of Utah then won the very large USAID Higher Education Commission funded grant for the establishment of a Center of Excellence in Water research in Pakistan. So looking at the Indus Basin and impact of climate change. So, both in many different areas, we're really privileged to have Tariq here, and we've been discussing methodologies and means of Pakistan and the University of Central Asia working together on areas of mutual interest, of which there are many. Also a very distinguishing record of Tariq is that he is the founder of the Sustainable Development Policy Institute of Pakistan, by far the premier policy shop that has done fantastic work in the country and continues to do so. So we're delighted to have Tariq over here, and I'd like to invite him now to give his talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I'm very grateful. Grateful also to Dr. Lakha for twisting my arm to come here. Very pleased to meet with all of you. I think developing closer academic relationships with the University of Central Asia in particular, and with other universities in the region and with academia in the region is very much part of my agenda. So when Mr. Lakha asked me to come and visit here, I was very happy to say yes, and to say that I'd be happy to come and contribute. Before I start talking about the subject, I was reminded recently there's an old history that we should remember. There's a wonderful book by Tamim Ansari. He's Afghan American historian. Is based in the US. The book is called Destiny Disrupted, and it's about. The motivation for that is that he was responsible for, as an editor, advising different presses. And one of the things he noted was that in all of the history books, including books about world history, there was hardly any mention of Islam. And he became rather curious about this, and he tried to push it, et cetera, et cetera. And so at the end, he ended up writing a book about this. And he presents a very interesting way of conceptualizing it. He says, look, in the ancient days, in this region, you can see that there are these two civilizations. There's the European civilization, which according to his conception was centered around the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean sort of brought everybody together. There's a whole civilization grew up, people interacted. There was academic interaction, Latin as a language unified the region. And then there was the Islamic civilization, which was an on-land. It was not a sea-based, but an on-land network. And he shows how the different pathways connected different people. When you started learning in one place and the teacher said, well, I've taught you as much as I know, and now you have to go to this teacher. And from Baghdad, they would send you all the way to Samarkand or Tashkent or Delhi, Lahore, Multan. I mean, so he said this civilization developed through this kind of an academic interaction. And now that academic interaction is gone, and in part, that is also why we've kind of forgotten our history. I think it's one of our visions to revive this kind of interaction, that we learn about each other, that we know who the great intellectuals are in different places. And if somebody comes and works with me at some point in time, I might say, well, I have taught you everything that I know, and now you have to go to Suhail, who's sitting in Bishkek, or somebody who's sitting in Istanbul or in Cairo, and that this kind of an interaction begins to take place. I think this is one of the visions that we have. Right now, we are not connected in that way, and we really need to sort of revive those kind of connections. One of my friends recently reminded me about, he went to Baku and he said, there's the place called Multan Sarai. Multan Sarai and Bukhara Sarai right across from each other. The caravan sarais used to come all the way, and the northern one used to go to Bukhara, and the southern one used to come to Multan. And so this was entirely a path on which the trade took place and knowledge took place. And now we need to come back and revive it, right? We have a common heritage. We need to come back and bring it back to life. Just a long way of saying I'm very, very pleased to be here. The more interaction we have amongst ourselves, the greater it will be. I want to talk to you about climate change and really about the challenge confronting developing countries. And the real topic which I want to bring to you is that we need to bring together what we know about climate change, but also what we know about development theory. And we need to bring it together in order to understand how to move forward. And I'm going to talk to you in a way about how these two need to be brought together and what the challenge is. But before that, one thing which I want to share with you is this little diagram, which to a certain extent helps me think about what the challenges are today. This is, it's a little thought experiment that we've done. The thought experiment is very simply this: the world, the Earth, this planet is 4.6 billion years old. 4.6 billion years, right? That's a very, very long time. We can't generally get our heads around it. So what we did is to say, well, let's scale it down to 46 years. And if this Earth was 46 years old, it was formed in 1973, it's useful to think about how it evolved. First life, three years later, 1976, when life first appeared, in the oceans, obviously. 1981, photosynthesis above land, right? It took about 8 years, that's 800 million years. So when people talk about terraforming Mars, think how long it took for us over here. 1993, atmospheric oxygen first appears. So it's really almost 20 years or 2 billion years later that oxygen first makes its appearance. 2010 is the Cambrian explosion, when suddenly we find this evidence of a massive increase in species biodiversity. 2012, when the first vertebrate land animals, those little snails, appeared on the ground. 2017, the dinosaurs came. 2018, they were gone. Today, 4 hours ago, we show up. And 1 minute ago, the Industrial Revolution started. And in that 1 minute, we destroyed half the world's forests. We filled it up with carbon dioxide. We filled it up with plastics. We filled it up with sort of non-biodegradable elements. We are well on the way of destroying something in that 1 minute that took 46 years to grow. This is not sustainable. We need to come to a system which is more sustainable. We've been talking, people like me, 27 years ago, I set up an institute in Pakistan called the Sustainable Development Policy Institute, mainly because we were concerned about these specific issues. What has happened in the meantime is that climate change has now forced everybody to talk about them. When I first started talking about sustainable development, this was actually earlier than 1992. 1998, I came back to Pakistan. And I started talking about, people generally would not take me seriously. And they said, well, you know, I mean, most people said to me, why are you wasting your time talking about this? There are too many other important things to be done. Today, everybody knows about it and people talk about it. And I think that's largely because of the threat that climate change has posed. So the question is, let's talk a little bit about that threat. I'm sure you know it already, but some of it merits repeating. But then let's talk about it as developing countries. How should we act? And some of the ideas that I want to bring is a way of synergizing what we know from development and what we know from climate theory. This is one of the things which has been kind of a weak component of the entire climate debate. The entire climate debate has basically seen developing countries as being passive recipients of support as the world sort of, you know, begins to address climate change. And that has neither worked nor is it the right solution. So let's look at some of the background issues, and then I'll come back and talk about the thing which interests me the most. Okay. Let me first start with what I call my 12 thesis about what we know. As some of you know, there is a very famous scientific panel which got the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2007, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I've been a longtime member of the Intergovernmental Panel, so you know, technically I am a Nobel laureate. Something that Suhail forgot to mention. It's okay, I mentioned myself. So what is it that the IPCC has taught us? What I try to do is to put it down in a very simple phrase. It's these 12 statements. And I will go through them in a little bit more, but basically this is what it is. Number one, climate change is real. Because of their deniers, et cetera, we have to say it. Number two, it's not something in the future, it is already here. We in Pakistan know it very well. Pakistan is one of the worst affected countries of climate change, but everywhere around the world, people now know it. It is already here. Number three, and this is very important, it is here to stay, regardless of what we do. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that even if our pestilential species were to disappear from the planet, what we have put in it is enough for climate change to continue. It's here to stay. It is going to be the defining feature of the life on this planet. Number four, we caused it. It is not because of sunspots. It's not because of the length of skirts or something else. It is because of human action, and in particular because of the fossil fuel revolution. Number five, we are sure. This is also in response to some of the deniers. And I'll show you one slide on this. Number six, this is very important. We know how to fix it. But A, only if we cooperate. and B, only if we act fast. The window is very narrow and it is closing very, very fast. Number 9, even when we fix it, we will still have to adapt. That means it is changing and there are things that we will have to do. Number 10, even after we fix it and even if we adapt, we will still have to bear the costs. Okay, it's too late for us to have business as usual or whatever, any other kind of life. It will be painful. Now, this number 11 is really the thought that I want to leave to you. The thought is this, that we, including and perhaps especially the developing countries, have to think about climate change not as a malady that we have to overcome, but as a condition with which we will have to live for the foreseeable future. I often give people the example of the difference between food poisoning and a heart condition. If you have food poisoning, you take antibiotics, you stay in bed for a couple of days, the fever is gone, you get back to life, and then you're back as good as you ever were. With a heart condition, that's not how it works. You actually have to moderate your life. You have to live differently. You have to eat differently. You have to exercise differently. But what you tell yourself is that I have to prosper, I have to thrive under this new condition. Climate change is not like food poisoning. It's not going to go. This is the condition in which all of you are younger than me. You and your children and your grandchildren, this is the condition and they will live. So what we have to learn is not how to overcome it, but how to prosper in a world which will be defined by climate change. This is the main point I want to make. I'm sorry, the rest is preamble, but we have to go through the preamble. Number 12, all of these V's are different, actually. This V is also, like number 11, is also developing countries. We will need help in adaptation and mitigation, of course, but also in the pursuit of prosperity, right? So this is a cooperative endeavor. Now, let me quickly show some of the slides which are about the preamble, and then I want to come to the main point, which is number 11. Number 1, climate change is already here. We have a number of indicators. Every single indicator, IPCC, actually the 5th assessment report has already chronicled them in great detail. You can actually go to the IPCC website, pull out all of these things are actually from the IPCC website. And these are all updated. So whether you look at the temperature gradient, already temperature all across the world is on the plus side. We have an average of 0.7% already above the pre-industrial mean. Some areas are higher. Of course, you can see that the Siberia is, of course, much higher than the others, but pretty much everywhere you look, you just see the brownish areas and not the blue areas. Ice sheets are melting at a totally unprecedented rate. The sea level is rising, has risen already, sorry. So this is actually what has already happened. This is not something in the future. The temperatures, as I said, not only are they rising, what we call is the temperature anomaly. How is this month's temperature different from the average for the last 100 years? That anomaly, this is the anomaly. And the anomaly, you can see all the way up to 1960, it was centered around 0, and then this begins to rise. So climate change, number 1, is already here. Number 2, it is here to say, this is a very interesting diagram from the IPCC, and I think it presents something which I particularly feel that we need to understand. And that is this idea of the, how does the, yeah, I'm just trying to figure out. There it is. The era of committed climate change. The idea of the era of committed climate change is that there's a period when it becomes irreversible. And this, these dark brown components are those which can be reversed through good policy actions. The light brown is something which is now there regardless of the policy that we undertake. So currently, in a number of different directions in which climate change is affecting us, heat, vector-borne diseases, occupational health, et cetera, all of those are reversible through policy actions, except for the extreme weather events. The extreme weather events are already locked in. So a higher frequency of extreme policy weather events are going to take place. By the time you get to 2030, you can see that the committed area becomes larger. By the time you get to 2080, the committed area becomes larger. This is, if we continue along the path there is, which means that the era of committed climate change is in some sense already here. Right? It's that some part of the committed climate change is already here and it is expanding. What this means, oops. What happened? And okay. So basically what this means is that this light brown area, by 2030 to 2040, it covers all the areas. Now we are locked into climate change. So no matter what we do, this is now there. So, the main point I want to leave with you is this. Climate change is not only here, it is here to stay. This is a heart condition. You're not going to take antibiotics and then 2 days later you'll be as good as new. You're never going to be as good as new ever again. You just have to learn to live in a different world, which is now defined by climate change. We caused it. I don't need to say anything more. Carbon dioxide levels are now higher than they have been for millions of years. And there's only one reason. I had another diagram, but I thought it would take too long to explain. The main thing is that the life on this planet, the life that we know, is really we are a carbon-based life form. We eat carbon, we excrete carbon. It's a cycle. So carbon is all part of the life cycle. And when you actually look at the carbon flux, you see that carbon is going up and it's coming down and it's all in a balance. The only thing is that we are now digging carbon out of the ground and burning it, and there is no counterpart. So it goes into the atmosphere, it goes into the oceans, but it doesn't come back and it's accumulating there. It's a small part, but that accumulation is now growing. So the part that's going into the atmosphere is causing climate change. The part that's going into ocean is causing ocean acidification. And both of those are now have the potential to kill us. We are sure. When I started working with the IPCC, at that time, the confidence level of our assessment was only 50%. By 50%, what we mean is that there was a 50% chance, probability, that what we were observing was caused by a natural phenomena. Today, it's over 99%. And when it gets to be over 99%, that means, the confidence level is 99%. That means it's less than, in fact, it's 99.9, 0.1% chance that it could have been caused by a natural phenomena. And that's pretty much the closest you're going to get. IPCC actually does a lot of this in terms of assessing. So this is exactly what I was saying. In 1995, our assessment, our confidence level was 50. By 2001, it was 66, 90. 2013 was 95%. And the latest report now is 99%. So that means, that our confidence in our analysis has now gotten to the point that we are sure that this is caused by climate change. I could actually talk a little bit more if there are questions about the way in which we assess the confidence levels, but let me leave it at that. We know how to fix it. Actually, the Paris Agreement did bring some of these issues on. The 2 degrees Celsius, everybody knows, scientists know that it's not a safe threshold. So the scientists, actually Jim Hansen wants to go back to 0 degrees above pre-industrial levels, but others talk about 1.5 degrees. which basically says the 300 parts per million or 325 parts per million as the target. And what this assessment does is it actually shows our previous projections and how close we are to them. But the more important thing is that it actually gives us the pathways for staying below certain levels. That means if we want to get to the 2-degree line, what do we need to do for the concentrations? If we want to go to the 1.5-degree line, what do we need to do for the concentrations? So, and the climate models are very complex, but there's some very simple results that they give. And one of those simple results is that there's a very strong relationship between long-term emissions and concentrations. And there's also a fairly robust relationship between concentrations and temperature increase. So we know that these are the ways in which these relationships hold. And so if we bring them down, and we know how to bring them down, then we can reach the results that we want. So the main idea is that we know how to fix it, but fixing it very simply means that we have to get to zero emissions within a span of time, either 2050 or 2080, depending on what your target is. And zero emissions, also, you remember pre-industrial was zero emissions because carbon was a cycle. So zero emissions actually means that we get out of fossil fuels. And again, we know how to do it. Scientifically, we don't know how to do it politically. Scientifically, the main thing is that the total amount of emissions, the emissions are caused by energy consumption. But when you actually look at the energy consumption, the balance, you realize that there are, it's quite unnecessary. The main thing that I want to show you is this. This is the amount of energy. Sorry, this is a little bit old. This is, I think, 2015. This is the amount of energy that we use every year. This is the amount of energy which is actually in the ground in petroleum, uranium, coal, et cetera, et cetera. And this yellow is the amount of energy that we get from the sun. So, there's really no comparison in terms of, our ability, our needs for energy and how much we actually get from the sun. In fact, one of the, the most powerful forms of energy that we use and have always used is solar energy. Can anybody tell me what that is? The most common, most powerful, the plants. Agriculture is a way for human beings to harness solar energy, right? It's been the most traditional way. And so, so it can be done. We know how to do it. But I'm going to skip this one. But the main thing is that the politics of it are rather complicated. Let me skip this one and go back. This is that only if we act quickly in order to reach the 2 degrees target, the emissions have to peak. Emissions have to peak fairly quickly and then go down to zero. So depending on which target that you choose, the peak is closer, and then going down to zero or even to negative emissions is also much faster. And of course, if we keep going the way we are talking about 5 degrees. Some people already are talking about 6 degrees. If we have some of the green policies in place, we're talking about 3 degrees. This is 3.4 degrees, and this is the 1.5 degree target. What this means is that by 2021, we have to peak, and then we have to go down to negative emissions. This is, by the way, all of this is part of the Paris Agreement. We do know that there will be pain nevertheless. No matter which way we look at it, temperatures will continue to increase a little bit. So even if 2 degrees is going to have major cost for the society, some of those costs we are already looking at. The cost of disasters and insurance has already gone up. When it comes to developing countries, the costs are actually quite significant, not only in terms of human life, but also in terms of other national objectives. Development will be affected because of energy security, financial constraints, changing markets. Poverty will be affected, our national security, water scarcity, food insecurity, etc. And national sovereignty will also get affected. So all of the things that you naturally consider to be part of the national targets, national goals will be affected. So we will have to adapt. Adaptation is really about water. So all of the impacts are really felt through water, because water has that particular feature of sustaining life on the planet. And all of them, whether there's too little water, too much water, water in the form of ice, water in the form of sea, or water which facilitates the disease vectors. So all of them are relevant. Now, let me come to the main point. The thing is that until now, developing countries, in the world, when we look at the climate discussions, you can actually think that there are three types of groups. There are the deniers, of which one large country is now, quite prominent among them. I will not name it, but everybody knows which one it is. But some other large countries are also part of the denial community. Their main, reaction is that this is not real. It's not a serious reaction, but nevertheless, they have taken it on. Another group is what we call the supplicants. And the supplicants basically means, please help us, we need help, we can't do anything without it. And oftentimes they've been passive, they've had a reactive policy about climate change, and the reactive policy is oftentimes incoherent. So developing countries have adapted a passive role. They have taken other policies and actions which are not consistent with what needs to be done. Climate policy itself is incoherent and ineffective, which all comes from the passive role. The other policies sometimes have an effect. Again, I have written a paper on this, which I'm happy to send to Suhail. The main idea here is this. The paper is on Pakistan. Pakistan has kind of, if you look at climate policy, you think that there are three structures to it. One is there's a conscious policy on climate change. You can pick up a document which says Pakistan's climate policy. That's basically just a list of bullet points. There are no priorities, no deadlines, no assignment of responsibilities, and no surprisingly, nothing happens. Then there is an unconscious policy, which happens in the interstices. So the country has set up a bus rapid transit system, which has actually taken people out of cars and put them into the buses. It has an afforestation program. It has fuel efficiency programs. We have installed hydro plants. We've installed nuclear plants. We've installed renewable energy plants, all for different reasons. And as a result of which, we've taken maybe 1 to 2% off of our emissions trajectory anyway, without saying it. The country hasn't taken credit for it, but it's just happening for other reasons. Now, in some sense, that is something that we need to learn from in order to move forward. The problem, of course, is that policy is not made for those reasons. Policy is made to attract dollars because, remember, the developing countries see themselves as supplicants. So their entire policy is driven by the fact, how can we get aid? That, to my mind, is not a very successful policy. I'll give some examples of this and then we'll move forward. I'm going to skip this. This is Pakistan's efforts. So already this was done 2 years ago, almost 5 million tons of carbon dioxide, 70 million tons of carbon dioxide per year had been mitigated, which was about 4.4%, 4.46% of our targets, without saying anything, right? You have renewable energy plants, LNG, liquefied natural gas, fuel efficiency standards, nuclear energy, hydropower, afforestation. When you add them up, you actually get some of the results. Nobody is saying that we are doing it for climate change. They're just doing it on their own because it's consistent with national targets. So what do we do? This, by the way, is a one of my favorite cartoonists. He passed away a few years ago, Leo Kalam. This one says, the person coming back to his house and saying, remember how I said I was happiest when we had nothing? Which means now developing countries are going back to when we had nothing, right? Now, but the main thing is developing countries have three objectives. We want to save lives and property. We want to promote sustainable development. We want to promote growth. And we want to honor our international commitments. Typically, the supplicant role says these are in conflict. So we will only focus on one and you help us do the others. Now let us think about an alternative, okay? And I'll keep the surprise up a little bit, suspense up a little bit and come to what the alternative is. The main thing to do is we cannot expect anything from developing countries. I think this from developed countries. Developing countries need to understand this. This also is from Leo Kalam. Daddy is saying to Matthew, not now, Matthew, this is Daddy's quiet desperation time. Developed countries are in a desperation mode these days. They are not really worried about what the other countries' problems are. So this I've already explained. One of my friends, Barbara Harris White, former director of Queen Elizabeth House, uses the word policy. When you say policy, how do you make it? What is your policy about policy? The policy about climate change is that you have deniers, which are now intensified exploitation, but there are some grassroots efforts. You have supplicants, which are mainly developing countries. But there are two interesting counterexamples. At this moment, the active climate policy is really driven by two groups. One is continental Europe, which has taken the lead in a number of climate-related areas. And the other one is China. And as developing countries, I think it's interesting for us to learn what they are doing and how they are doing it. Continental Europe has focused on climate issue as a demand management problem. We want energy. It's cheaper, it used to be, now not anymore. It used to be cheaper with fossil fuels. They're causing climate change. Let us try to manage the demand in such a way that either we reduce energy dependence or we shift to renewables. Right? That's their policy. So it's basically operating through demand management side. And really you have two major policy options. One is called feed-in tariffs, in which you basically, anybody who sets up a renewable energy plants, you have a committed purchaser. So the government says, if you set up a solar energy plant, we will buy electricity from you at this price. It gives confidence to the market. They will set it up, you purchase it, distribute it to the people, whichever you want. The other one is called portfolio standards, in which you, instead of doing it yourself, you tell the energy companies, you produce this thing and you manage the demand in the way that you want. That's the European approach. China didn't do this. What did China do? This is a very interesting question. China did not do any of this, the demand management side. If you go back to the climate debate, all through the 20th century, developing countries were exempted. 1997 was the Kyoto Protocol, in which all developing countries were exempted from any climate commitments, and that included China. And the countries of the world signed on it. I mean, there were some complaints, etc. So by and large, it was okay. In the early 2000s, when the emission figures came out, suddenly people sat up and said, oh my God, what's happening in China? Because the Chinese emissions figures came like this and then went up like this. Every year it started 25,000 megawatts of electricity, mainly coal. And coal consumption went through the roof, emissions went through the roof. The whole world started putting pressure on China. Say, you have to do something about climate change. China did something very, very interesting. China set up plants to produce solutions for climate change for export. In 2005, China produced nothing significant no significant amount of solar panels. Less than 0.1% of world production. By 2010, China was the #1 exporter of solar panels. 20% of the global market share was in the hands of China. Same thing in wind energy. Interestingly, the same thing in nuclear energy. China was not exporting any nuclear energy in 2005. It had a little bit. By 2010, it had turned the corner and it started bidding for nuclear energy projects. All of a sudden, it was competing. So what China did is, it said, look, climate change is a global problem. I can't afford the solution, but the Germans can afford it. I'll produce the solution, sell it to the Germans. And the result was that the Chinese industry came of age. They started selling it at high profits. It came of age. They brought down the cost dramatically. Today, solar energy is the cheapest form of energy available. Right? They brought down the costs. They brought down the cost to the point where China started installing it itself because it became affordable. But they started not through a climate lens, they started through a development lens. Okay? They actually learned the lesson from development policy. Development policy, the lesson is, number one, if you want to produce things efficiently, export them. That pushes you to be competitive. Number two, if you want to support something, support exports, because that is going to be more efficient than to support domestic production. Number three, position yourself in the market which is expanding. Don't position yourself in a shrinking market. And what China thought is, gee, everybody in the world wants these solutions. Can I produce and sell it to them? And they started selling those solutions. Now, the reason I'm saying it is that when we think in terms of development climate policy, A, we say we don't want to do anything, give us money. B, to the extent that we say we will do something, we follow the European example. Think of the countries that have followed the Chinese example. Can't think of them. Well, I mean, Malaysia has done a little bit. Brazil has done a little bit. But across the board, developing countries have not followed this model. So this is more or less the same kind of framework. I've just put that in the target. So they said the Chinese response was invest in human resources, education, and research. This is something which we need people to know. 2008. I was at the UN at that time, and I went and attended the first major international conference on climate change that China had organized in Beijing. And there were at least 1,000 researchers working on climate change in China, giving detailed, very well documented papers. Those 1,000 papers did not appear of a sudden. 10 years earlier, China had started investing. 10 years later, they were already producing. So invest in human resources, education, research, invest in the climate export industry, invest in hydropower, IT, rapid rise in exports followed by other countries, and showcase your efforts. Because you want to become supplier to the world, but you promote your companies, you relieve your pressure. This is the classic development theory. What they did is they looked at climate change as a potential, or climate industry as an infant industry. Those of you who study development will remember this concept. They treated it as an infant industry, and they supported it in the same way that the successful countries supported infant industry. And by successful countries, I mean not only China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, et cetera, et cetera. The result is increased output, increased exports, lower costs, followed by domestic consumption. So what China did was to pursue climate change in a manner that placed it in the center of their development agenda. They did not treat it as something that was outside of the development agenda. Now, I'm going to leave one more thought with you, and then I'll conclude this. The one more thought is this. Think about it like this. Climate change is what we call a natural resource shock. You had natural resources which can produce something. All of a sudden, they produce less. It's like a flood or a drought or something which takes away a part of your natural resources. Right? It's a natural resource shock. That creates macroeconomic problems, but it also creates development problems. The problem with natural resources is that natural resources determine your level of income. They don't determine the growth rate of your income. The growth rate of your income is determined by your policies. And so, let me just mention one study in this. There's a wonderful book by Clifford Geertz, the famous anthropologist, called Agricultural Involution. Clifford Geertz compares two countries. Both of them are island archipelago countries, and about the same size and about the same population in the year 1900. One is east-west and the other is almost north-south. In 1900, they had almost the same population, almost the same income. By the year 2000, one of them was an industrialized rich country, and the other one was a poor, struggling country. One of them is a resource-rich country, the other is a resource-poor country. So if I ask you which one is which, was the resource-rich the successful country or the resource-poor the successful country? What would you think?
Human resource rich.
The human resource rich. The two countries that I'm talking about, that Clifford Geertz was talking about, are Japan and Indonesia. Who had a better development plan. That's right. So if you have you could use them better. But if you don't use them better, you're going to lose. So, like if you look at Douglas North's work, he says North America, they had a development pathway in which the natural resources got converted into a sustainable growth model. But Indonesia did not. So in some sense, what we have is, we were Indonesia, and now we are Japan. And the question is, if we are Japan, can we have a growth model that will be sustainable? So the solution in my mind is this. We are all countries now, and all of us are faced with some feature, some manifestation of climate change. And we are out there trying to find solutions. What we need to realize is that everybody in the world is looking for the same solutions. The path for us is to export our solutions. Pakistan, for instance, has developed a number of innovative models. Our afforestation program now, after talking for 70 years, is now a successful program. For the first time, we have converted it. What we would like to do is to say, let's export it. We have a disaster management system. We set up an elaborate disaster management system. We have the worst floods in our history in 2010. There were much worse floods than the ones we had in 1976, the ones we had in 1990s. In the earlier floods, hundreds of thousands of people died. In 2010, it was in the hundreds. We have set up a better system. Now, the main thing is all of us, you can be from Indonesia, you can be from Kyrgyzstan, you can be from Kazakhstan. All of us have found solutions. The pathway for us is to export those solutions. What we need to know is that the world today, it's a different world. It's not the world that existed before climate change. It's a world in which climate change is a reality and will be a reality for the next 300 to 500 years. And the world will be looking for solutions, not to the problems of the 20th century, for the problems of the 21st century. We have to meet those markets, and we have the experience to meet those markets. That's the way of bringing climate and development efforts together. Invest in human resources, invest in climate exports, cooperate with other countries, showcase each other's efforts, and bring development back into climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much.